is indeed a sad day, a day of mourning, a day of remembering, a day of commemoration. But Tisha B'Av is also a day in which we study the history of the events and of the tragedies that took place on Tisha B'Av. There is a famous line that those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. But the truth is, history does much more than that. Studying history can help us to put things into perspective. We can even be inspired by history. We can see that our circumstances may be difficult, but that with willpower and with resilience, we can overcome even our greatest of challenges that lay before us. What I want to talk about tonight is resilience that takes shape in the form of resistance. Being resilient doesn't just mean to survive, but to stand up, be strong, be proud for what you believe in, and to be committed to your morals despite everything else that may be going on around you. In the years after the Shoah, as the world attempted to understand the horrors it had witnessed, questions started to arise. Chief amongst them was the question of how a people could allow themselves to be led like sheep to the slaughter, to paraphrase the words of our prophet Isaiah. Why did the Jews not resist? Why did they not stand up for their lives when destruction was so clear and obvious? One historian, Raoul Hilberg, was a strong proponent of the view that the Jews failed to resist the Nazis. Their minimal actions he describes as simply an attempt to tame the Germans in the manner one would tame a wild beast. Obviously, one must tread carefully when discussing these matters, but I personally very much relate to the arguments of other historians who say that resistance cannot be determined only in the form of physical resistance, but also in the terms of social, emotional, polemic, psychological, and spiritual or religious resistance. The great historian Yehuda Bauer, in describing resistance, uses the term Amidah. Amidah means standing up, but it connotes something much deeper than that. He argues that it includes any form of standing up in the face of those who sought to destroy the Jewish people. Every time a Jew attended a concert in the Warsaw Ghetto, they were resisting. Every time someone in a concentration camp smiled, they were resisting. Every day that you continued to survive in the Holocaust, you were resisting. And most importantly, every survivor and every one of us here today engaging in this event is continuing to resist the Nazis and what they sought to do. If resisting merely means fighting, then maybe we didn't resist enough. But if resistance means resilience, then our continued existence proves that our resistance was more powerful than even the Nazis could imagine. One powerful form of resistance was religious resistance. Nobody could blame a Jew for giving up their belief in God or for foregoing their practices, whether intermittently, temporarily, or even permanently. How could one judge a Jew who went through the Holocaust and denounced their faith or could not continue with their religious observance? Yet countless Jews not just didn't allow their faith or practice to waver, but on the contrary, during those most difficult and treacherous years, grew stronger in their faith and even more committed to their practice. For many Jews, their religion, their observance became their raison d'être, their reason to live, and helped them to keep going in the Holocaust. the values of Judaism, and the stability of its laws continued to guide the Jews through their most dark times. There are many records and stories regarding this. The story of a Hanukkah in Auschwitz or a Pesach in Bergen-Belsen. One such treasure comes from the responsa of Rav Oshri. Rav Oshri was one of the few halachic authorities to survive the Holocaust. And he was a young rabbi in the Kovno ghetto in Lithuania. During the war, many people came to ask him questions. And he wrote down his answers in note form, and then he hid them under the floor. After the Holocaust, after the war, after liberation, he survived and he went back and he dug up these notes and he wrote out more lengthy responses, which he published in a book in Hebrew called Mima Amakim, and in English, a book that I would encourage everyone to read, titled Responsa from the Holocaust by Rav Oshri. It is incredible to see the seriousness and punctiliousness that characterized the attitude of the Jews to the minutiae of religious law during these times. And what I want to do tonight is give a few examples of this. Rav Oshri tells of a story how the Nazis commandeered 1,000 slave laborers to work in an airfield to enlarge the airfield for bigger bombers. And the Jews were forced to work on Friday night, and then other 1,000 slave laborers on Shabbat day. He describes how on Friday night the Jews sat there and sang L'chadodi as they worked, saying the words Rav lach shevet be'emek habacha, pleading to God that we have been dwelling too long in the mire of tears, in the valley of tears. Those Jews who were on the day shift, they finished their shift at 7:30 p.m. And what was on their mind when they finished their shift at 7:30 p.m. was to ask Rav Oshri the following question. We know that at Mincha, we read the Torah portion of the next week. And they wanted to know whether it was acceptable at Mincha to read the Torah portion from that morning that they had missed. And in the winter, when Shabbat was already over, they wanted to know, was it too late to fulfill the mitzvah of reading from the Torah? Tonight is not a halachic talk. Rav Oshri, in short, responded that they should lane before Mincha, the Torah portion, and then lane this next week's portion at Mincha. And indeed, in the winter, he told them it was too late to read from the Torah. But he encouraged them that during the small break that the Nazis, Yimach Shemam v'Zichron, gave them, they should read from a Chumash. And one such Jew took a Chumash with him to the work site and read from the Torah portion from a Chumash. He also relates how one student, Rabbi Yaakov, came to him and said, I've been working in the airfields, but I've now been given the opportunity to work in the kitchen. And the first question he wanted to know is, was it permissible for him to cook on Shabbat in the kitchen? And more than that, if he was to cook, would he be allowed to eat from the food that he cooked on Shabbat? He argued that working in the kitchen gave him a better chance of survival. The conditions weren't as bad, and he would be given a little bit more food. Can you imagine that that is the question you had? And Rav Oshri told him that indeed he would be breaking Shabbat in either location. And as a result of the fact that it is important for him to stay alive, it would be preferable for him to work in the kitchens and of course eat even from the food he cooked on Shabbat. There are many such smaller questions where the rabbi was asked by a town who the only thing they could find was a cracked shofar. We know on Rosh Hashanah we blow from a shofar. One isn't supposed to blow from a cracked shofar. What should they do? Is it better not to blow? And of course, Rav Oshri responded based on the halachic ruling that if less than half the shofar is cracked, it is still acceptable. And of course, he took into account what it would have meant for the Jewish people to blow shofar on Rosh Hashanah during the Holocaust, and he allowed them to use a cracked shofar. Similar questions were asked about whether they could use electric candles for a Friday night. Or how could they do Havdalah? Were they allowed to use the electric lights? They were in the ghetto, and believe it or not, they had no oil, no wicks, no candles, but they had electricity. Just cast your mind back and think about, what would have I been bothered about on a Friday afternoon if I lived in the Kovno ghetto? Would it have been whether I had Shabbat candles or not? He discusses how when the Russians took over Lithuania in 441, outside of Kovno there was the town of Slobodka. Many of you might have heard of the Slobodka yeshiva. And the Russians had put buildings up for laborers. When the Germans came in, they turned these buildings into ghetto housing. And some of the Jews who worked as carpenters had stolen some wood and set up a sukkah between these buildings. And they came to Rav Oshri with the following dilemma. It's Sukkot. We want to fulfill the mitzvah of eating in the sukkah. However, we know that you cannot fulfill a mitzvah with something that is stolen. Is it permitted for us to sit in the sukkah which has stolen wood from the Nazis? Mind-boggling that someone would even think to ask such a question. But Rav Oshri, like a true rabbi, pushed aside emotion and answered halachically. And he said as follows: the Nazis never brought their lumber from Germany. Where did they get the wood from? They stole it from either the local Jews, who were very involved in lumber production, or from the local Lithuanians. There is a rule that if something is stolen from you, and you give up of ever getting that back, the item now becomes ownerless. Any person who lost something to the Nazis had no hope of getting it back. Therefore, he deemed these planks of wood to be ownerless. The Germans took ownership of them illegally, and therefore it was permitted for them to use the sukkah. The very fact that we could take something like this and have a halachic to and fro. I have these discussions on my phone in the comfortable office. Someone calls me up, Rabbi, what should I do about my sukkah, my mezuzah? Here is a conversation, a halachic debate about a sukkah with stolen wood from the Nazis. In fact, Rav Oshri says that there was one Jew who actually was saved because he was sitting in the sukkah when the Germans cleared out the buildings. The Jews were worked to the bone. And one morning, when they got together to pray, Rav Avram Yosef, the Shliach Tzibur for the morning, gets to the blessing, "Blessed are you, God, Shelo Asani Aved, that you never made me a servant." And he shouts out, "How dare I recite the blessing of a free man? How can a hungry slave, constantly abused and demeaned, praise his creator by uttering these words?" How could a Jew in the Holocaust say the bracha, Shelo Asani Aved? And Rav Oshri said that already from earliest times, these blessings were never instituted to refer to physical freedom, but they reflect on spiritual freedom. As Adam spoke, and mentioning Frankl, Viktor Frankl said, we were never completely enslaved because we always had the ability to choose what we would do and how would we respond. Shelo Asani Aved. The following story blows me away. There was a day in the Kovno ghetto, October 29th, 1941, that was known as Black Day. The Germans ordered every Jew in the town to come for a selection in the plaza. 30,000 Jews stood there. And one Jew approaches Rav Oshri and listened to the following question. He wanted to know, the Jews here are facing almost certain death, giving up their lives for the sake of being Jewish. What is the appropriate bracha to make when you give up your life? Is it Baruch Atah Hashem, who commanded us with his commandments, Al Kiddush Hashem, on the sanctification of God, or L'Kadesh et Hashem, to sanctify God? That was his big question. And Rav Oshri said to him, the truth is it's neither. It's l'kadesh shemo barabim, to sanctify God's name in public. These are the questions that the Jews of Kovno had. I want to finish off with a story that doesn't just show resilience, but shows that Rav Oshri as a rabbi understood the importance of resilience for the Jews during that time. He tells of a boy who had his leg amputated by the Nazis and was in a hospital next to the Kovno ghetto. And he desperately wanted to pray, and he wanted to have a pair of tefillin, and he sent a message to Rav Oshri, can you please send someone with tefillin discreetly into the hospital? And they told Rav Oshri that there is a rumor that any items that someone brings to the hospital, when they leave, they burn these items. Could they bring the tefillin, even though it meant that the tefillin would be burnt? Of course, tefillin not just being a holy item, but containing the name of God. Rav Oshri says, if I would have known for sure that they would have burnt it, then indeed I would not have allowed it. But I cannot rely on a rumor and stop this boy from fulfilling a mitzvah. And please God, in the reward of that mitzvah, God will protect those tefillin. And most importantly, he knew that for this boy, putting on tefillin was a form of resilience. It was a form of resistance. That he wanted to wear them would give him the strength to survive. In 1941, the hospital was burnt, and this boy perished. But in his last moments, as the boy protected these tefillin, he saw someone who was escaping, and he gave him the tefillin. And in fact, Rav Oshri witnessed to be able to see these tefillin. There are so many more stories. But the ideas represented here are so powerful. And as I was thinking, how could I wrap them up? I thought, let me use Rav Oshri's words himself. Obviously written originally in Hebrew, but translated into English. These are some of the most powerful words I've ever read. He says, did our enemies, the Germans, many of them church-going sons of church-going mothers and fathers, did they ask their priests and their ministers how to care for the Jewish dead? Were they concerned to learn whether one may use clothes stolen from a dead Jew, or whether one can use a curtain ripped from the parochet, from the Aron HaKodesh, where the Torah scrolls are kept? Did they receive religious dispensation to bayonet pregnant mothers? But we Jews did inquire as to the proper prayers to say after food when forced to eat on a fast day. We wanted to know the correct form of the blessing a Jew says before going to his death in sanctification of God. I cannot say it better than Rav Oshri in his own words. I will conclude by saying that indeed Tisha B'Av is a time where we are sad, where we do think about painful things and we do discuss painful ideas. But indeed the Jewish story is one of miraculous survival, but also is down to the tremendous resilience that we have shown. May every single one of us in this room find the resilience to continue to fight our own personal battles. And may collectively, the Jewish people, the world over, find the resilience to fight the battles that face the 21st century Judaism.
Yeah.